Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving straight into a critical piece of geopolitical analysis from Imran Bhatti, a specialist in governance and public policy. He recently published a paper examining the intersecting, deeply complex crises happening in Pakistan as of April 2026. Let's unpack his argument, because he makes a very compelling case that the world might be completely misjudging a massive, unseen powder keg. To really grasp the stakes here, we have to start with this chilling historical analogy the author uses. He writes, in 1914, a single bullet in Sarajevo collapsed a global architecture. The system was too tightly wound to absorb the shock. Bhatti points out that global catastrophes, they rarely just arrive out of the blue, right? They arrive as a pattern of systemic stress. Back in 1914, the newspapers called it a regional tragedy, and 6 weeks later, 15 million people were dead. Bhatti is making the case that right now, Pakistan is that tightly wound architecture, and the bullet, it's already been loaded. Now you might be wondering, how does the rest of the world see this? For a long time, international analysts have viewed Pakistan through this somewhat dismissive lens of managed deterioration. They see a regional basket case with economic woes that just needs to be, managed. But the author's reality check is intense. We are talking about a nuclear-armed state of 240 million people. It sits at the absolute geographic intersection of the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia. It is literally the pivot upon which the entire regional order balances. If this pivot breaks, everyone feels it. So here is our roadmap for this explainer to understand how this breakdown could happen. First, the unseen powder keg. Second, a global tug-of-war. Third, the internal fracture. And finally, the ultimate extinction risk. Okay, Section 1, the unseen powder keg. The absolutely crucial point Bhatti highlights here is something called the security dilemma spiral. He argues that Pakistan isn't just dealing with run-of-the-mill instability anymore. It's paralyzed by a fundamental structural breakdown. Because of exactly where it sits on the map, and honestly who it owes money to, every single move it makes to appease one global ally instantly triggers an existential threat in another. You literally cannot solve one problem without detonating another. It's a massive trap. Which brings us to Section 2, a global tug-of-war. Picture Islamabad caught in a relentless four-way tug-of-war. We've got four distinct global powers pulling at it: China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and the USA. Each of these powers has a massive, non-negotiable primary interest, and each applies pressure at a very specific, vulnerable point within Pakistan's borders. Let's break down exactly how these overlapping interests create this immense pressure. First up, we have the Chinese anchor. Through the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, Beijing has poured over $65 billion into Pakistani infrastructure. Why? Because China desperately needs access to the Arabian Sea to bypass the Malacca Strait, which is a major choke point the U.S. Navy could easily cut off in a conflict. So Beijing really needs Islamabad to be stable and quiet. But the reality on the ground? Increasing insurgent attacks on Chinese workers are turning this so-called all-weather friendship into a source of profound, dangerous frustration. Then, let's look at the Saudi obligation and see how this ramps up the tension. The source notes that this relationship with Riyadh has shifted away from just financial bailouts to some incredibly high-stakes military commitments. With reports of a mutual defense agreement surfacing in early 2026, there is massive speculation going around about an Islamic bomb guarantee. Basically, if Saudi Arabia faces an existential threat, Pakistan's nuclear umbrella might cover them. And Bhatti notes, it almost doesn't matter if his agreement is formal or informal. What actually matters is how Tehran, Tel Aviv, and Washington perceive it. Okay, now add the Iranian entanglement into the mix. With the U.S.-Iran conflict escalating in early 2026, Pakistan's porous western border has literally turned into an active front line. Pakistan shares a border and a very restive Baloch population with Iran. Because Pakistan hosts U.S. interests and owes money to Iran's rivals, Tehran has every single incentive to activate internal sectarian groups and border proxies. Iran essentially needs to keep Pakistan too destabilized to ever be used as an American staging ground. And finally, the American transaction. Bhatti argues that Washington has a decades-long pattern of treating Pakistan not really as a valued partner, but as a tool of utility. He calls this instrumental exploitation. According to the author, this historically transactional and honestly often abrasive relationship has left the country socially and politically fractured. As a result, you're seeing a severe domestic anti-Western backlash right now, with a desperate population increasingly tilting toward pro-Iran sentiments. So that's the pressure from the outside. Let's look inside with Section 3, the internal fracture. The author uses this incredibly vivid architectural metaphor that I think hits the nail on the head. He says Pakistan is like a building that has survived multiple earthquakes by sacrificing its structural reinforcements each time. It's still standing, yeah, but it's standing on progressively less and less stability. Let's look at exactly what those missing reinforcements are. First is the economic breaking point. Think about this number for a second. 55 rupees. In March 2026, there was a historic 55 rupee per liter hike in fuel prices. With global energy prices skyrocketing, the author states this isn't just normal inflation. It represents absolute crushing economic trauma for the average citizen. It's the worst in the nation's entire history. Now combine that staggering economic pain with this number, 240 million. That is the sheer human scale we are talking about here. You have a massive, very young, and increasingly economically desperate population. When a population of this size hits a wall of total economic impossibility, Bhatti points out that it creates the perfect conditions for a domestic detonation. And that is something no military force on Earth can simply suppress. And if the streets are boiling over, well, who is actually in charge? The source highlights a terrifying crisis of command. The civilian government, the military establishment, and the judiciary are reportedly in open conflict right now, with the former prime minister imprisoned and supporters filling the streets. Why does this matter to the rest of the world? Because nuclear deterrence requires a stable, highly centralized decision-making structure. When the civil-military relationship breaks down like this, the question of who actually controls the nuclear triggers becomes frighteningly murky. Which leads us to our final act, Section 4, the ultimate extinction risk. The true worst-case scenario here isn't just a military coup. It's something called state fragmentation. This is defined as a total collapse of central authority, to the point where different factions of the military, regional power centers, and sectarian groups start operating with their own independent agendas. If the central state fragments, the custody of nuclear assets becomes a completely unanswerable question. This is the actual nightmare scenario that keeps policymakers awake at night. And according to the analysis, the most chilling fact is this. There is absolutely no international mechanism in place to secure nuclear assets during a state fragmentation event. None. The UN Security Council? Totally paralyzed by great power rivalry. The US simply lacks the credibility to step in safely. China lacks the internal military projection to intervene. And India? Well, if India tried to intervene, it would immediately trigger a massive nationalist response, leading to the exact regional war everyone is trying to prevent. The world is entirely out of options if this actually happens. So, where does this leave us? The author maps out 3 possible trajectories from here. First, managed deterioration, where the state just sort of limps along with IMF bailouts and repression, which honestly only delays the inevitable reckoning. Second, authoritarian stabilization, meaning a strict military intervention that stops the immediate bleeding but completely ignores the underlying rot. And third, genuine fragmentation, a cascading collapse triggered by the collision of regional wars and domestic economic death spirals. Bhatti concludes that our inability to prepare for this isn't due to a lack of data. We have the data. It's a failure of imagination. Think about it. The very systems built to manage risk, the global alliances, the IMF bailouts, the military management, they have ironically become the source of the risk. We're just so used to the system holding together that we flat out refuse to acknowledge that the primary risk factor is now a present, imminent detonation scenario. I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought from the source material. Are we failing to imagine the worst before the pattern completes itself? The powder keg is real, and the fuse is lit. Understanding these forces isn't just about geopolitics. It's about recognizing the sheer fragility of the systems that hold our world together. Take a moment to really think about what happens if we ignore the structural cracks until it's simply too late. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.